I've always been intrigued by the idea of a solitary life with as few entanglements as possible, and the question of why anyone would walk away from their life, not necessarily to build a new life, but to live as stripped down in existence as possible, with no family, no partners, no friends, no job, no home, and no material possessions. In effect, to live with as few attachments and with as little identity as anyone can maintain. To most people, this would be completely counterintuitive or even crazy, because most people spend their entire lives trying to forge these connections and acquire these things in order to achieve some stability and happiness. And to me, it seems a mystery as well, but I think it's something which is really fascinating, because I think it addresses certain existential questions that we all wrestle with on some level. Certainly many people get frustrated with aspects of life and consider walking out on it, or might dreamily fantasize about what that might be like, but few people actually go through with it. There are a number of examples in literature which deal with this, and I just read one such novel which is all about someone who does this very thing. So I want to talk about 5 different books which address this subject matter and give different insights into these questions. The novel I just read is Sugar Street by Jonathan Dee, and in this story, an unnamed narrator gives his account of driving away from his life with a bundle of money, and he goes to this small town and sets himself up in this dingy apartment, and he's taken great lengths to try to avoid any sort of detection or ways of people from his previous life of finding him. And when he establishes himself in this very grimy upstairs apartment, he just lives there as simply as possible and tries not to have any encounters with other people, in part in order to avoid any sort of detection or connection with his past, but also to try to live as, quote, good in existence is possible, because he's very aware and self-conscious of his status as a white straight man from a privileged background, and but he doesn't want to be involved in any of the issues in modern America where people are oppressed, but he inevitably finds himself drawn into some of these issues, and has a number of encounters which, because he lives so simply and completely on his own, are almost amplified to have greater significance and meaning. And in one way, you could say this is a kind of liberal hand-wringing about all of these issues and this kind of guilt to do with identity and privilege. But in another way, it really shows someone in an example of crisis who finds his previous life and his normal way of existence completely untenable, so takes these steps to try to completely free himself from it. And it's an interesting dramatic tale. There's this whole question of what is the truth about his past, and this kind of hangs throughout the novel as it goes into the minutiae of his day-to-day existence. I'm trying to live so simply. And I think it's a really interesting novel, if not an entirely fulfilling or satisfying one. Next is another recent novel called Tides by Sara Freeman, which was published last year, and I read it at the very beginning of last year. And it similarly follows a woman who has just walked out on her life, and we don't really know much about her past, and the whole question of that really hangs throughout the novel. But she doesn't have much money. She goes to this seaside town and tries to live as simply as possible. She spends a lot of time swimming in the ocean. She does take a job out of material necessity in order to rent a small place and in order to feed herself, but otherwise just tries to live completely simply and quietly while mulling over her past and almost sorting through the details of it to try to understand the truth of it. And this is a very moving and effective novel in how it does this and uses this contemplative existence to ponder these questions. A personal favorite novel of mine is The Hermit by Eugene Ionesco. This first appeared in English back in 1974, and it's a very little known novel now. But in this story, the central character, in the very beginning, he's just won the lottery, and he decides to live as simply as possible. He gets an apartment in which he just sits all day, very quietly, very contemplatively, just sort of staring at the wall and out and thinking through a number of things. And you would say a novel like this, it has very little action, but all of the drama happens internally as he's sorting through the meaning of existence and what life is all about. So it's a quite philosophical novel in that way, but it handles it in this quite light-hearted and very down-to-earth way that I found very approachable and moving. And Eugene Ionesco has always been one of my favorite writers. This was his only novel. He was mainly known as a dramatist. And one of he's kind of known as one of the fathers of the theater of the absurd because he wrote these plays which were quite comic in tone and which made very little sense. I mean, there was a complete departure from realism, but which gave sort of insights through this juxtaposition of images and situations which you could interpret in different ways to do with the meaning of life or to do with larger political issues. So yeah, I just love this novel. Another one of my favorite novels of all time is Anne Tyler's Ladder of Years. And in this novel, a woman who is a wife and mother, she decides to just walk out on her life one day and go to live very simply in this apartment, and her only goal is just to read all day long. And so we follow this drama, and again, there's the question of why she left her old life behind, but also the happiness that can be achieved by living so simply and straightforwardly and just reading all the time. And it's something I can empathize with like so much as someone that loves reading and really wants to spend as much time in my life as possible doing it. But it follows the drama and the foibles of embarking on such an encounter and the things that we lose out on by pursuing such an existence. And the copy of this novel I have is this Franklin Library edition, which is quite gaudy in its kind of leather bound and golden importance. But what I really like about this edition of the novel is there's an introduction by Anne Tyler in which she talks about her inspiration for writing this book, and why she first started writing it was she was on the beach one day and she was wearing a t-shirt that just said 100 Years of Solitude, after Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel. And a woman passed by her who saw this shirt and sort of referred to it and said, "Oh, I wish I could have that." And Tyler meant, "Oh, what? You mean the Marquez novel?" And she said, "No, I wish I had 100 years of solitude." She was obviously very frazzled with dealing with her family on the beach that day, so made this kind of whimsical observation, and it inspired Anne Tyler to write this entire novel, and I think that's a wonderful story. And probably one of the supreme examples of this kind of literature is Walden by Henry David Thoreau from 1854, his book, which is a social experiment on independence, kind of political commentary and satire, and also a kind of how-to guide for self-sufficiency, in which he details his experiment of building his own cabin by Walden Pond and trying to live on his own. And the goal for self-sufficiency within the larger society and whether that can even be achieved. So it's a very meditative account of this experience, as well as like fine details of just how much it costs to buy the materials to live independently like this. And so, and in some ways I find it quite humorous and fun in how he embarks on this, but also really moving and meaningful how he addresses why he finds it so difficult to live in this society in America at that time, when his tax dollars would go through to help fund a war which he didn't believe in, and which is why he was arrested at one point for not paying his taxes. And so making this non-violent resistance to the larger things, but taking these further and extreme steps to try to live on his own. Now, from what I understand about Thoreau's actual life, he wasn't as solitary as most people would really imagine from embarking on a quest like this. I think he was quite sociable and would continue to communicate with a lot of people while living out on his cabin. But nonetheless, it sort of stands as an example of someone who tries to live as simply and as mindfully as possible. And a commonality amongst all of these books is that they give examples of people that try to live as quiet and solitary in existence as possible because they feel themselves caught in systems of family and community and society that they find untenable and want to be freed from. So much so that they are willing to abandon all comfort and security. And this is because these systems force them to be complicit with certain ideologies and machinations which are partially harmful to individuals, groups of people, and the environment. So their strategy is to escape by stripping away as many of these attachments and living as quote-unquote good and unobtrusive a life as possible. And I'm particularly taken with these examples in literature because their means for doing so are not in any way religious. I think a lot of people that wrestle with these issues go down the route of becoming a monk or a nun in Catholicism or Buddhism, but either out of an inherent mistrust or indifference, they take a much more existential route in solitary living. None of these examples from these books entirely achieve their intention or work out in the way that the characters would ideally like, because it is nearly impossible to live in any prolonged and sustained way without the support, both the emotional and physical support of other people and communities and larger government. There's also the issue of privilege, because someone must possess a certain amount of privilege in order to be able to renounce it in the first place. But I think they are really interesting in how they acknowledge and attempt to address these different questions, because they are questions that I wrestle with myself, but I am someone that would definitely never be brave enough to just leave behind my life, because I do really like it so much, but I am aware that there are all of these issues in the background and I don't really know what to do about them. So I'd love to know if you've read any of these books and have any thoughts about them or this wider issue in general, or if you know of any other examples in literature of people that walk out on their lives because they are struggling with all of these issues and and trying to find a better way to live. Thank you for watching, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.